Hi, my name is Easton Hitchens, and today I'll be comparing the state of the American Empire today to the state of the American Empire at the end of the Vietnam War. So, the question that we want to be thinking about through this presentation is the current state of the American Empire better or worse than at the end of the Vietnam War? And to help answer this question, I will be touching upon the boxes of trust in government, cohesion in government, cohesion in society, military comparison, and an economic comparison. As you can see from this data here, trust in government is at an all-time low. During the Vietnam War, which was the presidency during those times were Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, as we can see here, the trust in government was on a downward slope, but it isn't anywhere near to as low as it is today. Today, we were approximately about 20% of people trust the government, which back then we had approximately about 60%. This shows that people trust the government less today than they did at the end of the Vietnam War, which is kind of a big statement considering that before the Vietnam War, the trust in government was on the way up, and then once we get to that period, it just starts the downward trend, and it just keeps going down until we hit that Reagan period where we start to go back up. And Vietnam was really that turning point for people to trust in the government. And as we can see here currently, 9/11 showed a peak of trust in government, and we're currently on a very bad downward slope to where we are today in 2020. Next, we talk about the cohesion in government. Here, we can see the support from each branch of the legislative branch, the House and the Senate, and their support of the president. As we can see here with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the Senate was highly favorable of the president, while the House was lesser. And during this time, the House and the Senate were Democratic majority. And with both Johnson and Nixon being Democrats, that means that what they want could often be pushed through the legislative branch because they're the same party. So they obviously saw mostly eye to eye on certain policy. Today, we can see that the House is a majority Democrat and Congress is a majority Republican. This can cause what we call a stalemate in government, where there really nothing can get done because if one branch doesn't support the legislation, that then it won't get pushed through and it won't make its way up to the president and it won't become a law. We've actually seen this quite a bit over the Trump administration, where the legislative branch won't side with the president on certain laws because they're Democrats and he's a Republican, where Congress obviously is going to favor with the president. Like the impeachment trial, the House of Legislation impeached Donald J. Trump, but since Congress is majority Republican, it wasn't pushed through Congress because they obviously side with our Republican president. Another issue is with the cohesion in society. During the end of Vietnam War and today, we both see riots from people. The Vietnam War, we obviously had the anti-war protest, and we're at the end of the civil rights movement. We're still seeing some backlash from that. So people were protesting against our government's actions in war and some of our social issues. Today, we see protest of political ideology with members with radicalist groups such as Antifa and other groups rioting against what our president is doing. And we see the Black Lives Matter protest where people are protesting police brutality against minority groups such as African Americans. And these can kind of be a tendency of butting heads within people in society, whether they're on their belief system and whatnot. Here we can see the cohesion of different political ideologies and generations based on their trust in the government. Here we can see the millennial group, Gen X, Boomer, and the silent generation, their trust in the government, which is, like I said earlier, at an all-time low. Here, back in the Nixon-Johnson era, we can see the Boomer generation start to get their trust shown here, because this is when they probably became politically active, and the silent generation, the greatest generation, all showing their trust in government as it's going down. So here we see a cohesion in the fact that people all over the spectrum are trusting the government less and less. The same with today. People are trusting it less and less, with actually the millennial group actually showing an increase, a small increase of trust in government. And it's the same trend with the political ideology, and it tends to change over which party is in office. Here we can see during the Obama administration, the Democrats show more trust because it's in a Democratic presidency, and here with the Trump administration, it's Republican because he's a Republican. And we can see that with each president, starting with Nixon and going all the way to Trump. Comparing the militaries of this time is kind of difficult because we had two different scenarios. Back then we were trying to fight the Vietnam War and the war on communism. And today we're fighting the war on terrorism and different things along those lines. See here, back in the middle 1970, 1980, about the 1975 mark at the end of the Vietnam War, we can see that military defense spending was at approximately $100 billion, which is a very small amount compared to today, which is at approximately $600 billion. But when we take a look at that, we compare that to the percent of the GDP. It's actually a quite high percentage back in 75 at approximately like a 6% compared to today where it's below 4%. See, that shows that even though we're spending more on our military, since our economy is growing so much, has grown so much since this period, that it is less affecting our GDP percentage than it is back then, where we're spending a higher percentage of our profit on military compared to today, where it's a much lower percentage. In economic comparison, we can see that back during this period, the economy was all over the place. It had super low points and high points and low points and high points. It was all over the radar there. It wasn't very stable. You had real high years of like up to 6% growth down to a negative growth where it got worse. Whereas we can see today, our economy is more stable. It has far less ups and downs outside of the outlier of the 2008 economic bust. But as we can see, for about 2010, it was back up and it's kind of stayed relatively level from here on out. So in conclusion, trust in the government currently is at an all-time low, even though that decline in the trust in government started at the end of the Vietnam War. Cohesion within government is at an all-time low because we see that split of ideology from the House of Representatives and the Senate, where they're butting heads over which legislation to pass. Cohesion in society is struggling. That's kind of comparative to back then, where the cohesion was struggling between the ideology of whether the war in Vietnam was just or not. We see the overspill of the civil rights movement, where people are still having somewhat disagreement over which rights people should have. Our military is currently stronger at a lower cost of our GDP, even though we're spending $500 billion more compared to then. Our percentage of GDP is less affected by that, where we're below 4%, where then it was almost 6%. And our economy is more stable now because Then you had those dramatic ups and downs, whereas today it's a little more settled out outside of the bust of 2008. So, with all this in mind, I think that the American empire is in a worse state now than it was at the end of the Vietnam War, with the trust in government, with the low trust in government and institution, the low cohesion in government, and the struggling cohesion in society. Even though they were struggling with cohesion then, they still were fighting the common fight of communism. Today, it almost seems like there isn't a common fight that we're fighting anymore. We're almost just fighting ourselves. So, with those in mind, I believe that the American Empire is in a worse state now. Even though we thought that the American Empire was going to end then, it obviously didn't. I still don't think it's going to end now. I just think it needs a lot of work. Our empire needs a lot of work from the inside out. Even though our economy is more stable and our military is stronger, that isn't enough to save the American empire internally. So, thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation and listen to what I have to say. I really appreciate it, and I hope you take the time to think about whether or not the American empire is stronger now or stronger during the Vietnam War. Thank you.